Now I'm going to turn it over to MAS Vice President and Q Director Mary Rowe, who's going to tee up the next section.
Yeah, there was a lot of frantic scrolling there, and thank you those people that are trying to tweet. I appreciate that. It's hashtag QNYC. I think anybody over 50 that's tweeting, we deserve extra credit, don't you think? And I just, where is Alex? He'll be so pleased. How many tweets did I just do, Alex? Like I did 10 probably, which is probably a record for me. Thank you, at least 10. The reason, I just wanted, while these guys are setting up, a couple of quick things. We love weather, but it did prevent a few people from joining us tonight. Stacey Mitchell, as you see, isn't here because she got stuck on a plane. Similarly, the World Bank folks couldn't get out of Washington, and we've just had a few glitches. But John Rahm somehow swam here from San Francisco. You're about to meet him. So he deserves a medal because he was up at 3 in the morning. And Benji's going to take this panel and have some conversation, and then we're going to open it to you. But what I want you to do is you hear them talk. I want you to think a little bit about how we're going to spend tomorrow. I really appreciate the preceding folks, and these folks I'm sure will reinforce it. This is not for the faint of heart. You heard Fred, we're fighting for the uniqueness of New York and to try to oppose monocultures and really think about uniqueness. So tomorrow is an all-day working session, and we need as many of you to come back. And we're going to, Andrew, I see you nodding, and you're going to go to Andrew's group. It's going to be a great one, Design Matters. We have working groups, and you'll see the flip charts that are around you during the reception. Those state out the topics, and you saw it in your registration material. 9 groups working in parallel. We'd like you to join one. And if you join one, you get a button like this. So I just look like a crazy person for an hour because I put 3 on, but only to inspire you to know that the facilitators for each of these groups have these buttons. So start thinking about which group you're going to work on, because we really need to focus specifically on those policy areas and come up with some tangible things to form our own, where's Eric, our own manifesto. Love the pop-up manifesto. So we need a manifesto for Q. So think about that as you hear from this panel. Benji, thank you so much for coming from that crummy weather place, Miami, to join us. And I'll take it to you. You can take it from here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you to the presenters earlier, and we'll welcome the panel. We've got a few minutes, so we're going to go through this very quickly, but you've got a really interesting panel of 4.5. And, you know, so we lost Stacy today because of the weather, so it's great. We've got an entrepreneur and a graduate of the 10,000 Businesses program of JP Morgan. We've got that's Raj Thakkar. Seth, who is both now in real estate. So those of you who are against big deals, maybe we can pick on him later. But was also with the New York Economic Development Council and ran all of these business incubators that New York did, along with a lot of great deals in bringing in tech into the city. John from San Francisco came here by red eye. Did you come by red eye? You just arrived this morning?
About 2 hours ago.
And so they have got their own pressures there. It'd be interesting to hear. He's with the planning department. So we got a planner. And Margaret, who is from an investment bank. So you've got multiple points of view. And the first thing I'm going to ask them is, so which stuck out? What was the idea of the 9 we just heard? Either blew your mind or you reacted to it and said, well, fancy idea, never going to work. You can take it anywhere in that spectrum, and I'll take it in this direction. We'll start from over here. Yep.
Sure. You know, actually, I really like the last idea. I think sort of the literal idea around sort of a cooperative and ownership together is one that's a great one. I think sort of sharing costs, working together is fantastic. I also think maybe a little bit less literally, just the idea that large spaces are more expensive by definition. The more square foot you need, the more expensive it's going to be. And that in sort of certain stages of your business, maybe you need 100,000 square feet to 200 to 300. So I just think the more that people work together, whether that's through ownership or through leasing together, I just think that 1, that you bring the cost down, and 2, you're able to create your own flexibility within a space. I also think that certainly in New York, certainly in San Francisco, I think that cultures on the coast have really recognized quicker than the rest of the country that there's more than just economic benefits to sharing space and working together within a space. They're just the synergies that come from building your businesses alongside other people who are doing it, sharing those ideas, those tensions, those growing pains. So I think that there were probably a lot of benefits to your idea beyond just affordability that I think are really strong and really compelling.
John?
I can't resist starting by saying I grew up in Detroit, so I really appreciate all the attention to Detroit.
Are you going to move back to Detroit now?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. I mean, I do think Detroit has the potential of sort of becoming a new model for a new American city in a real way. It's really extraordinary what's going on there. You know, I heard a lot of themes in these presentations. One was the whole idea of sharing space and reusing space for multiple purposes. I mean, I love the idea of the schools, Gail. I mean, I think schools sit there vacant 80% of the time, and it's, you know, and their public facility, what a waste that is, right? I love the idea of sharing not only facilities but thought. What's happening in San Francisco and Silicon Valley is that Silicon Valley, in a very big way, is moving north to the city, and it's moving north to the city because, number one, employees want to live in the city, but number two, the companies are finally getting out of this intense security mentality that they have to put walls around everything that they do, with a few exceptions like Apple, which will never leave their spaceship. But they are realizing that the interactivity between different disciplines is actually beneficial to them. And the smaller startups are realizing that in a big way. And they want to be with artists, they want to be with people of other disciplines, they want to be with planners and architects and other folks. So the culture of the city is changing dramatically, and the nature of Silicon Valley is changing dramatically because of this shift to an urban environment. So I think that the overlap, I love the idea, I absolutely love the idea of the overlap between culture and the arts and tech. I mean, this STEM versus STEAM, I think you're absolutely spot on with that. I think it's absolutely critical, and I think even Silicon Valley is getting that. They're realizing they have to do that to evolve and to survive and to thrive.
Rather than picking a specific idea, I'll offer two, I guess, meta comments. First is I actually thought it was very interesting to hear the discussion about Detroit. And I think that Detroit, not just as a city, but as a symbol, is an important one. And I think the idea of trying to ensure that our cities as melting pots, as aggregators of people, as concentrators of people, ensuring that our cities grow and thrive and on the one hand don't experience the fate that befell Detroit, but on the other hand try to learn from the spirit of optimism that's coming out of so many years of trial and tribulation. I think that's really important, and I think I mean, the one comment I would make about the presentations is I think a mistake that a lot of cities make, and I would urge those who are advocating for a rebirth in Detroit to think about this, is trying to replicate the success of other places. And I think New York, for example, as we have tried to become a technology center, one of the things when I was in city government, we spent a lot of time trying to drill into people's head was it wasn't about becoming the next Silicon Valley, it was about being New York's version of a technology center. And I think Detroit is not going to be New York and shouldn't try to be New York. You know, another thing that I would say with respect to Detroit is that a point of inspiration should be that in many ways New York was Detroit not that long ago. Our population had declined dramatically. There were vast tracts of abandoned land here. And so there is a path to success. And then the second thing I would say, and I'll be much more brief about this, is that what I really found most inspirational about the presentations was just the variety of ideas and the variety of definitions of entrepreneurship and the focuses that people had of different areas of entrepreneurship. And I think, to me, that's really what the ingredient for success is, the key ingredient for success. It's smart and talented and creative people thinking creatively and then being able to actuate their ideas. And so, you know, I think we see a lot of evidence of that existing here in New York, which is certainly something that's encouraging and gives me a lot of hope for the future.
So for me, I loved all the ideas, but two of them really resonated quite a lot. The pop-up space, I've always, being an entrepreneur, I've always seen small business getting smaller and smaller, you know, so, and the concept of entrepreneurs being risk takers, and in my mind, it's always been entrepreneurs are risk minimizers. So the pop-up space, you can test the idea, you can rent for a day, you can rent for 6 months, and see if there's something there. That really resonated with me. And then I've actually got two businesses, Charter School Business Management and FOREsight. So we ourselves are 90% diverse on our team, 80% women, and just the impact that the diversity has had on my company and the communities that we serve within charter schools. Code Interactive, I love the idea to get more individuals from diverse cultures into coding. You know, I love that. So those are the ideas that really resonated with me.
So pulling from going up and doing a meta conversation or just the streams, part of me wonders whether, particularly with a comparison to cheap space in Detroit, is this all a real estate price game that we need to lower prices or make it easier for entrepreneurs to find space? Therefore, we need to tame the white-hot real estate market, and so not everything becomes, you know, New York's version of a billboard that actually is a store. Because it's very expensive rent. Is it just that? I mean, the way Vin framed it was, what are the spatial interventions and land use interventions that we could have? Is it all just about the price per square foot?
I mean, certainly a lot of it is. I think that's a big part of the game. I mean, I think I can't remember who mentioned it, but you know, a big portion of your costs as a small business, medium-sized business entrepreneur is real estate. So I do think that's a big part of it. I do think that there's also sort of the broader, in the same way that people are like, oh my gosh, Detroit is so inexpensive, there are also parts of New York that relative to the neighborhoods we love to speak about that are so, that have no vacancy, and oh my gosh, Dumbo's now $45 a square foot. All of those conversations sometimes ignore the fact that New York is a massive place where there's certainly untapped space, untapped buildings, et cetera. So I think as much as it's as literally about, you know, the price of real estate, it's also about better transportation. Maybe we wouldn't talk about some of these neighborhoods differently if, you know, subways actually got there at some point in time, or, you know, we had rapid, I mean, it's just a broader conversation. I think it's about accessibility and space, and I think, you know, there are still many parts of New York that are affordable. I don't think that that's a permanent situation that we should take for granted. So certainly in working with the public sector, there are obviously land use and zoning implications. You know, maybe there should be rent stabilized retail. There are lots of implications I think that you could take from the public sector in terms of maintaining at least whatever remaining affordability there still is.
I mean, this is a really complicated issue. Yeah. And you know, what's funny about it is that people talk about people getting priced out of New York because it's too expensive. In reality, the reason it's too expensive is because people aren't getting priced out of New York. More people are coming than we're able to accommodate. Now, certain uses may be getting priced out of certain areas, and that's something that I think we should be concerned about and that we need to think about. But you know, for every remedy that people come up with, when you have a supply-demand imbalance, there's some sort of unintended consequence that usually comes with it that may have an equal or even worse implication on the problem. And I think in reality, on the real estate front, if we want to stay affordable, the recipe is actually simple, although not so simple. I mean, one is that you just have to build more. If more people are coming, you have to create more space to accommodate them. That creates problems because everyone loves to live in, you know, their community that has a certain character, and people don't want change. But the fact is, if we want to build more, there's going to be change. Second thing I think is public safety. One of the things that has allowed New York over the last 20 years, in fact, to retain its very large middle class, for artists, notwithstanding some displacement, to continue to come to New York, entrepreneurs and young people, is the fact that whereas in the past the number of neighborhoods that people like that were able or willing to live in was rather limited, now the geography has expanded dramatically because neighborhoods that in the past were unsafe are much safer. And then infrastructure is the third piece. Because even if a neighborhood is safe, if you can't get from there to somewhere else, and vice versa, people aren't going to be able to live there. And the one other thing that I would add, I think when we talk about New York, we need to think not just about the city of New York, but about the entire region. And I do think, and I've become increasingly convinced of this, that part of our solution to the real estate price crisis in the city is to think outside of the boundaries of the 5 boroughs. And I'll give you just one statistic, which is that the city of New York has about 25,000 people or so per square mile, but the New York metropolitan area has a population density of about 2,800 people per square mile, which is roughly equivalent to the population density of the LA metro area.
Actually, the LA region is now denser than the New York region.
So, we have the ability around our incredible mass transit system, the MTA, Long Island Railroad, Metro North, to densify downtowns and suburban communities, and I think that offers us a real chance to allow people to stay in the area in an affordable way and still have access to all of the great amenities that the city has.
That's a really good point. I mean, these issues are regional,
Yep.
and I like to think of it not as a real estate cost crisis, but as an accessibility crisis, right? And accessibility hence brings in the cost of space, it brings in the equity issue and the transportation issue, which are absolutely key. I mean, Detroit's really cheap. Detroit's public transportation system sucks, obviously, but it's so cheap it almost doesn't matter at this point in its history, right? But I think that I think the whole issue of accessibility and how these issues are managed at a regional level to me are key to this discussion. San Francisco is a city that's 47 square miles, so it's about twice the size of Manhattan, and it's 1/10 the population of New York City, of the 5 boroughs. And yet there's this perception in the region that the regional issues of accessibility and cost and everything happening in the crisis of affordability all has to be solved within that 47 square miles. And what's particularly frustrating to me about that is that many of the suburban communities, in fact, the Silicon Valley communities in particular, want nothing to do with not only affordable housing, they want nothing to do with housing at all. Yeah. They literally actively discourage new housing development in their communities. And so it is really, really an interesting problem. I do think that's where government needs to step in to force these issues at a regional level.
So the question then, and I'm getting this kind of Manhattan-centric or at best Brooklyn view of where entrepreneurship is supposed to happen. And we've seen it happen. We've seen kind of a shift in Williamsburg and Bushwick so that now people, even the first hipsters who came in, are now priced out, and there's lots of articles of them moving upstate along the Hudson, finding small towns to move to. But why hasn't it happened in East New York? Right? Is it just an infrastructure game and just safety? Or is it that the entrepreneurs are saying, well, I really want to start in Lower Manhattan?
Well, I think you have to be careful about saying that entrepreneurship hasn't happened in East New York. I mean, there are all sorts of entrepreneurs in the city. There are people who own barber shops. There are people who own bodegas. There are people who own industrial companies. And I think you do see a lot of that happening all over the city. I mean, East New York and neighborhoods like East New York have really suffered from chronic issues that are issues that all of us in society are responsible for and responsible for figuring out how to fix. And as a society, we haven't done a particularly good job at doing that. I mean, there are issues with education, there are issues with public safety, there are issues with discrimination, there are issues with infrastructure. I mean, it's the list is a long one. Here again, I think it is the responsibility of government to figure out how to remedy them. As I said, to date, we haven't done a great job doing it. I won't even pretend to say that I have the answer to that.
Yeah, I didn't hear anyone complaining about bodegas taking over some of our neighborhoods, but in Manhattan, it's like, okay, the Walgreens are there. So let's shift a bit more to the point of view of the entrepreneurs or the people who own small businesses and are starting up small businesses. And what we heard a lot about was space. We heard a little bit about technology and using technology. We heard a lot about culture and artists needing this space. What about other handholds? The pop-up space was one. If you can, minimize risk by committing to a week. What are the handholds? And I'll ask particularly for John of this, because what's in the headlines in San Francisco is the disparity in cost of housing, but not very much on businesses. what's the experience in San Francisco. What other space handholds or public intervention handholds can we provide for entrepreneurs or for artists who need the cultural space?
Well, actually, there is a crisis of affordable commercial space in the city in the big way. Artists are being forced out. Local businesses are being forced out. What tempers that in San Francisco, perhaps more than here, is our regulatory environment, which actually, in this respect, actually is helpful. And that's particularly our controls on chain stores and on size of businesses, right? San Francisco is overregulated in many ways in terms of land use. It's sort of notorious for that. But with respect to retail businesses, we have very strong controls in almost all of the neighborhoods on chain stores, which we call formula retail, and we have incentives and regulations on the size of storefronts. So combining storefronts, for example, is discouraged, if not outright prohibited, in some of the neighborhoods.
I read recently an article that evaluated the kinds of regulations that San Francisco had on whether you could, for instance, as a bookstore, serve toasted bagels, because that was not allowed. You were allowed to serve cold bagels, but not toasted bagels.
That's right.
Now so they need to rationalize
that was serious overregulation, and we changed that. But we were doing that. We not only did that, we controlled what type of utensils you used, whether they were plastic or metal.
Raj?
So a great program that holds the hands of small businesses is the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses Program. I graduated from it 2 years ago, and it helped me achieve lots of outcomes. So it's out there. It's a $500 million initiative in several cities around the country. The flagship is here in Long Island City at the LaGuardia Community College, and just focusing on the outcomes, and this can happen for lots of small businesses. It helped us go from a $4 million business to a $5 million business. It created 10 more jobs, and there's 5 more vacancies that we have. An outcome was because we've oversaturated the charter school market. We launched the second brand, FOREsight Financial Services for Good, and the thinking behind what I learned in the 3 months with Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses, that's what launched the second brand, where we can serve nonprofits, social enterprises, and minority-owned and women-owned small businesses. So it's a totally free program. You have to apply. It's highly competitive, but that's another hand-holding. It's not exactly public. It's free, but it's seriously backed by Goldman Sachs.
Margaret?
Yeah. One thing, I mean, that maybe would not be that deep, sort of, and this is not to stay so New York-centric, is just subsidize it, right? So it's like we clearly have an affordable housing crisis, and the city, some years there's more subsidy than not. Clearly right now we're in part of the sort of largest, de Blasio's 200,000 unit program, which is significantly more than we were doing before, I think, or larger than any other city has announced. And it's very difficult to do the appropriate community planning and how do you think about the neighborhoods and what units. But the actual model is not that deep. There's the cost to produce housing, and there's how much you want to restrict the rents, and the gap is filled through various state, city, and federal incentives. So the city could decide that, and I think it's far more complicated for a variety of reasons, the city could decide that there's some amount of subsidy that we want to provide to businesses of a certain size with a certain mission that pays certain wages. Maybe it's forever for those businesses, or maybe for it's a certain period of time as they grow to some scale. But part of the solution that the public sector provides in many other arenas is subsidy capital. So in terms of hand-holding, I think it would probably, I think most people would agree that if you just lowered the rent in some way, that would certainly be helpful.
Yeah, although, again, it's complicated.
Of course it is.
I mean,
Oh, I don't think that's easy at all, to be clear.
But I actually agree very strongly with that. And one of the things that really irks me in the current conversation about affordability is that we treat housing subsidies as if it's motherhood and apple pie. We're giving money to help people live in the city. That's not really what we're doing. We're giving money to developers, and then we're asking developers to give space to people to live in the city. But somehow when we talk about economic development investments, that's a giveaway to corporations. And sometimes it absolutely is a giveaway to corporations. But you know, to the same extent that we think about using public resources to invest in a public good that the market isn't producing in a place like affordable housing, we should also think, I think, about using government resources to create a public good that similarly isn't being created in a place like jobs at good wages for people who have relatively low formal education levels. And I don't think that that's a giveaway any more than affordable housing subsidies are a giveaway.
So
I agree.
what about City Mart and Sasha's idea of, you know, the amount of procurement that the city does is a rich resource for entrepreneurs, and very often it's very hard to get to even play that game. And extrapolating that to what Carolyn said at the end, there's lots of government buildings that are empty. Can we tap those and provide it as kind of a resource to entrepreneurs? And both of those are resource plays that the government holds.
I mean, the answer is yes. I think, though, I mean, the one thing is that I think New York City has many fewer government-owned buildings that are empty than people might think. We've spent the last...
MTA has a lot.
Yeah, well, actually, you'd be surprised, which is not to say that there's nothing, and it's not to say that's not a really good idea. I think it is a good idea. But I think that the government absolutely has a role to play in this. It has a role to play in subsidies. It has a role to play in terms of the real estate that it owns. It has a role to play in terms of land use policy. I mean, we make decisions all the time that are driving up the cost of living in the city. Again, often for very good reasons. We landmark large districts. That keeps density down. That drives up prices. There's a reason why we do it. We want to preserve the character. That's not a bad thing, but there's a cost to it. And so, you know, I think that if affordability really is something that's important to us, we need to decide what we're going to forego in exchange for it, because there's no decision that we can make that doesn't have some cost to it.
You know, I think it's important to point out that we have developed a world culture now and kind of a world urban economy of the 1% cities, right? I mean, you could probably count on, you know, 10 fingers the number of cities that are really that this is happening to. It's it's happening here. It's happening to San Francisco on the West Coast, London, Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo. I mean, and I don't. We are in a paradigm shift here in terms of people's living preferences and the world economy. That's very different than it was even 10 years ago. And that's not going to change. I mean, yeah, I agree that we need to build a lot of new housing to support folks because the supply is not keeping up with demand, but that's not going to lower housing prices. It's going to maybe keep them, in my view, it'll keep them from continuing their meteoric climb, and it might, if we really keep up with some supply, it'll help temper the increase. But I think the cities that we're talking about really have to think differently about how they spend public resources in supporting the characteristics that we're talking about here, whether it's the arts, whether it's small businesses. It's a totally different way of thinking about this stuff. It is not business as usual, I don't think. Otherwise, what we're going to end up with is a situation where the cities become as specialized as our business community, right? Where you have New York is the financial center and nothing else, and Detroit is the art center and nothing else, and San Francisco is the tech center and nothing else. And these places will become very specialized and will become kind of monocultural in and of themselves.
Right, and we all know how bad monoculture gets in cities. That's what did in Detroit, at least the first wave of Detroit. Let me open it up now to the audience for their questions, and I'll start with the gentleman in front who had a question from very early on, and he got me and said,
Hi, thanks. I was actually asked to be provocative. I'll try. So actually, what the ideas from the first group of people, some of them really, really fascinating, particularly the entrepreneurs, and I was a little, my heart sank a little bit when I saw the next panel coming up of a lot of big shots talking about their ideas. I'd kind of like to see that inverted, maybe, how the entrepreneurs would feel about their policies. But no, there were some things that were struck me.
We could leave.
We'll get to that. Let me see. The idea that you know we need more government regulation or less government regulation. I think everybody on the panel expressed some a difference of opinion, sometimes the same person, about, we need to deregulate this more, or need more regulation here. And isn't that a problem? This is my first question, if I can have a couple. My first question is, what's the criterion that you're using here? That when you pick a winner, right? That we want the city to look something like New York did in the 1950s, or we want New York to look more like the Silicon Valley in certain respects. But at the same time, we want more racial diversity. We want lots of cheap housing and this and that. So I'm an economist, so we think in terms of trade-offs. And the question I have, I guess, basic question is, what is the criterion of success that you're going to use? Is it, growing population? Is it a lot of small stores? Are you, is it diversity in race? Is it diversity in land use? That sort of thing. And we talk about all these nice things, and the first group of people, had a nice range of different ideas, some involving different levels of public policy. So I guess my question is that, what do you know, if you're going to use public policy, what are your criteria for successes, and how are you going to avoid stakeholders, and how are you going to avoid rent seeker, that is, people who are seeking special privileges, and get through all that morass, which I agree with you is very complicated, particularly when it comes to land markets.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to answer that? I mean, are we choosing winners? The definite point of view?
I think it's such a big question, right? Obviously, I think
he's an economist. He has to come up with big.
Yeah, I bet even on this panel we share some similar views and some very different views, like everyone in this room, and then like everyone who lives in New York, right? And so I personally am a tree-hugging, die-hard, ridiculously progressive liberal. So like I care a lot about the arts. I care a lot about sort of a diverse economy, but mostly my number one guiding principle, which gets awkward at work sometimes, is that every single person who lives in New York should be able to make minimum wage and find a way to live here safely, happily, have opportunity, move around easily. So I just think New York City should be more affordable for people to work, live, get around, et cetera, because it's just too expensive in lots of ways, not just finding a space for your business, but living and all that. There are many people who disagree with me, and if I got to take over the city, I would push it way too far in one direction. So I think the question of like how we pick winners, or how policy comes to a place to get to the right answer, is this perfect balance of everyone sort of like pushing against each other and people having different opinions and sort of getting to some average that's dynamic and sort of moves around over time. I'm sure I didn't answer the question at all.
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, to me, the issue is diversity in multiple levels. The issue is diversity, economic diversity, cultural diversity, racial diversity, and cities are becoming, because of the economic engines that are driving our cities right now, they're becoming less diverse, right? I mean, the average wage of a Silicon Valley worker now, I should say, of a tech worker in San Francisco is approaching $150,000. That's median. And so we have, and the vast majority of them are white, and white men, I should say. And so that in and of itself is driving the city to become a less diverse city. And it's also, of course, having a huge impact on housing prices. But to me, the issue of diversity ultimately is an economic issue. I don't think, I really truly believe that if our cities lose their diversity over time, they will also lose their economic vitality.
Okay. Next question. Over in the third row, yes. Can you say your name, please?
Yeah, my name's Colin Miles Campbell with Wikiberg. I just wanted to ask you guys about the Erstad Law, and if we could talk about that a little bit, if I could also include Gail Brewer. What's that? What's the process for repealing that this spring and getting that in front of Albany to actually make that happen?
Yeah, it's as I understand, it's the law that requires the state to set the rent control laws for the city. Is that correct?
We cannot pass in New York City anything that's more pro-tenant than currently exists.
I think. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I would think that the chances of that getting repealed are pretty low, just from a purely just doing the political calculus. And you know, affordable housing is another complicated issue. I mean, we have 3 million units of housing in New York City. We have 1 million of those are home ownership units, and the other 2 million are rental units. And half of the rental units that we have, more than half in fact, are either rent regulated or rent stabilized. So we've got a lot of rent regulated housing in New York, and it's done a lot of good historically. It's kept neighborhoods diverse, but it's also created some real distortions in the market, especially in the 40% of our rental housing that isn't rent regulated. That's an issue for people who aren't lucky enough to happen to have hit the lottery and lived in those 60% of the rental units. And you know, another challenge that we face with affordable housing is that you know, the mayor, I think to his great credit, is pushing an extremely aggressive affordable housing program, preserve or create 200,000 units of affordable housing. But what I'm seeing on the ground in the real estate market throughout New York City is that the signal that that's sending to the marketplace is that this is an administration that's willing to rezone anywhere in the city to residential uses, the land values of which are usually much higher than commercial land values. And what that is effectively doing is driving out of business our most vulnerable companies, which are the companies that employ the very people that we're trying to house in our affordable housing. So, you know, that's not a direct answer to your question, but I just think that we have to be very thoughtful about how we address these problems because there are all sorts of unintended consequences, even to the best intentioned program that government puts in place.
Hi, I'm Claire Wise, New Yorker. So I have to ask a San Francisco question, which is, so Hayes Valley was a kind of experiment when the freeway, I think it's called Hayes Valley, when the freeway came down, and San Francisco let some business people experiment, and now I hear it's going away. But how come in New York City we don't take all these spaces under the FDR, under Park Avenue in Brooklyn? Why don't we let businesses actually do things more with public spaces, and why is it so restrictive? Do you think there's a difference between what San Francisco will do and what New York will do?
Well, I think just for the benefit of the audience, Hayes Valley is a neighborhood just west of City Hall where we tore down the second of our 2 freeways that came down in the 90s and developed a lot of public space. And part of the deal with the state was that the land this is both freeways actually, the land that was given to the city from where the freeways were had to be 30 to 35% affordable housing. The experiment that you're talking about is on land that is slated eventually for housing, but is now being used by pop-ups and by retailers and containers, and has been wildly successful. In fact, the beer garden is basically a bunch of picnic tables and a chain link fence parking lot, and it's packed every weekend night. So, Hayes Valley is now a victim of its own success because part of that whole strategy was to totally ban chain stores, which on the surface you think this is great, right? Well, Hayes Valley, the permanent retail now in Hayes Valley has no neighborhood serving businesses left. It's all upscale furniture stores, restaurants, and clothing stores. And there is not one neighborhood serving business left in the neighborhood, except Walgreens, ironically, which had been there before the controls went into place. So this is the issue about regulation. I think that the challenge with regulation is getting the balance right. And secondly, to regulate what we need to and not regulate what we don't. And we almost always get it wrong. We have this mismatch between what we regulate versus what we need to regulate and vice versa.
From this side, yes.
Hi, Ann Evans from Ashoka. One of the questions that I had as I heard the discussion about the regional need for management of some of these issues was that the first comment that someone made, and I forget who it was, said, well, yeah, we're really going to need government to play a role in that. And I can't help but think that we need a different kind of team to take on some of these questions. And so I'd love your thoughts on who needs to be on that team. It seems to me that there are other voices that can raise the questions in different ways, bring more pressure, kind of create the motivation and the real pressure for change, and create different kinds of options to put on the table. So I just love to throw it open for anyone who has ideas about that.
A different kind of team?
You're talking about to kind of have a regional, to create a regional voice? I mean, I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I just think that there may be other...
You're assuming there's actually a team.
I'll give you a little bit more to go on here. It just seems to me that it's a new way of thinking about team, I guess is what I'm saying. So what if there were a group of people from the greater San Francisco, the greater New York area, who could come together, in a sense the way Q has come together, to sort of say, we care about these things, draw people to that idea, and say, all right, let's work on these together. So I think that in a way this gathering is a great prototype for what I'm sort of thinking about this. And I think it's so easy that if we say, well, government needs to take care of that, frankly, that ain't gonna happen. It's not gonna happen the same way that I think we are all thinking we would like to see it happen. So I really do think that from civic organizations, from business, from universities, from government, there are people all over these different sectors of our world, citizens, small business, large business, all of it, who might have an interest in those subjects if we could kind of position the call in an attractive way that made people who really care about it raise their hand and say, I'm in.
So I'm going to interpret it as one way, that there needs to be voices, and that you need to have an ecosystem around this, that it's not a single player. And I think that I don't think that's what Seth meant, that government needs to do something about it. Government reacts when there is political space created by voices in the population, right? So you're very right that there needs to be a regional conversation around entrepreneurship. So we scale from regional and finding the cheaper spaces, although we do know that spatially there are spatial dimensions that just do not work for businesses or the arts. One dwelling unit per acre is not going to support businesses. And in a way, the kind of collapse that happened in 2008, a lot of townships in Long Island are now thinking we need to densify because they're losing all their people, and it's only the older generations that are left. Young people are leaving, and now they're open to densifying, whereas before they were like, we're not New York. Sorry, commentary by the moderator there. I think we have space for one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
I game the system and grabbed the microphone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Paula Siegel, so I'm Caroline's partner. And I have a question I would love to hear everybody's responses to. So what do we lose if we start adjusting our whole regulatory system to treat all of the space in the city, both commercial and residential space, as a public good instead of as a market commodity?
I've heard that idea too from Enrique Peñalosa, who says urban land should be a public utility.
So what do we lose?
What does that mean?
What do we lose?
Yeah, do you mean, yeah.
Can you explain what you mean?
So the simple model that we can all look to that works here is the Cooper Square Committee's Community Land Trust, right? All decisions about the 21 buildings that are situated on land that the trust owns are made by the board of the Community Land Trust. The board is 1/3 residents, 1/3 other people in the neighborhood that are impacted by what happens in those buildings, and 1/3 just other people who care about keeping that neighborhood stable and affordable, right? There are no market interests and nobody's making money. This is not an investment. It is a place to live. It is a place for people to have their businesses, and all of the decisions are made by people who are invested in keeping it that way. And what do we lose if we actually just scale that model out
to the whole city?
To the whole city, to every kind of space that there is.
I can
love these
name
big
one.
questions.
We would lose massive amounts of tax revenue.
Yeah, you'd lose the market.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
You'd also lose decision making.
We could think through it.
No, I mean, I feel like I've been the voice of no on this panel, and I certainly am. No, and I'm actually very optimistic about the direction that this city and cities like it are moving in, notwithstanding the real problems that we have. But I mean, that would just require a complete shift in the way everything is structured in our city. I mean, what would you do about all of the incumbent people who own land today if their value of their land is getting marked down? And I mean, you shrug your shoulders, and I understand if it's the company I work for, which is a large corporation, maybe you say, okay, so they lose something, but not everyone who owns land in the city is a large corporation. A lot of them are middle-class people whose largest asset, their entire, you know,
but in 1974, every
single building that had 6 units or more was rent stabilized.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean it was publicly owned.
Yeah.
Someone still owned it and maintained it and created value.
Sure. I'm not suggesting that we shift ownership, but I'm suggesting, what if we started shifting our regulatory structure so that we were looking at space in the city as places for people to live and work, as opposed to places that could be turned into equity, right? And rent stabilization is another way to do that, right? Somebody's job is still maintaining that building, and they're certainly making a living doing that.
Yeah, and look, there's a lot of good that's come out of rent stabilization and rent control, and then we also, during the 1970s, lost thousands and thousands of units of housing because people couldn't make money owning their real estate, and they burned their buildings down to get the insurance. So, I mean, as I said, I think if we lived in a different society, and maybe this is the society we should live in, something like that could work. I think it would be very difficult to make it work just by changing that in the society that we live in.
I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about, I mean, I do think it requires a real, I mean, it might even require in some places a constitutional change, but that's, well, I mean, even from a regulatory standpoint. But it would be interesting to look at models where only certain types of space are regulated in that way. You know, whether it's cultural space, whether it's nonprofit space that's currently a nonprofit tenancy. I don't know. I mean, I do think it's worth experimenting. I mean, I think the community land trust model, by the way, is a really interesting model that could be used in these kind of situations. I'm a big fan of experimenting on these things, right? I mean, government is not very good at experimenting. We react instead of, but I do think that there are ways to do this where we can experiment with some of these ways of approaching, and I think that's one.
And on that note, we'd like to thank the members of the panel, the presenters earlier, and the audience for this very interesting conversation.
Thanks, you guys. Thank you, Benji.
Thank you.
Thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to Benji and John in particular, because they came from far away to come. Mary and I are very tempted to riff on a lot of it. We were riffing over here. We were having a great time in this little pod over here for a while, but there are drinks out there, so I'm smarter than that. I know that we need to be super efficient. So, number one, I want to thank you all for coming tonight in the slush fest that's outside. Number two, I'm really pleased to see that the Committee for Urban Entrepreneurship has quadrupled in size. So thank you, because now you are all members. Tonight's discussion has given us a tremendous amount to work with in our policy thinking and the manifesto that we hope to arrive at by 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mary on the proceedings for tomorrow.
So I just keep these people to stand up. Ann Evans, Carol and Peter, Sharon Whiteley, Dan Barish, Colin and Ricardo, you're so obedient. James Lima, I see you, James. Andrew, Eli. These are the people working on working groups tomorrow, and they've got a button for you. There's a button in your future. I'm just carrying this little knit of buttons. So think a minute which group you want to work on. If your group is boring, we'll let you defect. But just look at the caliber of people that are leading your group. You're not going to want to go anywhere. You're going to want to invest in them tomorrow. So we need you to get a drink, get a button from James, or from Anne, or from Carol, or from Peter, or from Andrew, or from Ricardo, or Colin, or Eli, and Sharon. Where's Sharon? And Sharon, thank you back, thanks Sharon. And we're back here at 9 bells, sharp, no weather excuses. 9 bells to get a good briefing on good basic information and stats around New York conditions. Then we're in those working groups. We're going to have a chance to hear a little bit more from John Rahm, to tell us all the wisdom from San Francisco, and from some other folks through Jerry Chu, other cities and then we're going to have at it and make that manifesto sing.
I want to thank our live stream audience for being with us. Those of you out there, thank you. You have to go to your own refrigerators. But anyway, thank you very much.
Have a great morning.